Hello and welcome to the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee and today I want to talk about swearing. To swear or not to swear, that is the question for today. I want to look at foul language in games. Do we use it too much? Do we use it effectively? Should we use it at all? For me, I've always thought that foul language, its use depends on three main things. Its settings, so where are you going to use it, the audience that might be listening to it, and of course the context in which it's used. And I'm going to look at these each in a little bit of detail, and the idea is I'm hoping I can stimulate a conversation. Now, a little disclaimer before we start: I swear too much. I know I do. I spent over a decade working for a shipping company, surrounded by former merchant seamen whose every other word was foul. So it inevitably rubbed off, and that 12 years of conditioning ruined me. So I know I swear too much, and I do try to restrain myself. So I thought I'd put that out there first before I start preaching about swearing. So let's first look at setting. Now, of course, you wouldn't use the same sort of language in different types of settings. So, for instance, you might have, you wouldn't swear in a business meeting, for instance, yet with some of the same people in that meeting down the pub, your language might be different. And the same applies to us as gamers. We wouldn't, for instance, swear at a demo game in front of members of the public and children, but it might be different in our games room or a shed of war or loft or wherever it is that you're playing with your group of friends. So there are some societal rules that sort of dictate when and where is appropriate, and on the whole, I think we as gamers tend to follow that. When I'm at shows, very rarely hear people swearing because they're very conscious of the people that are around them. An example as well, it also depends on how well you know people. So, for instance, when I first went, the first ever game when I went and joined the Rejects, they were all on their best behaviour. There wasn't a crossed word from any of them. Didn't stop them beating me in the game, but that's another issue. Now, many years later, and the banter flows backwards and forwards, and there's plenty of foul language, but it's all done in a good-natured banter. But we'll come to context in a minute. So just to recap that section, obviously it depends on where we're doing it and what that potential audience might be. So we're going to look at audience a little bit more. So obviously, in front of children, you're going to moderate your language. So if, for instance, when members of the Rejects bring their kids along to games, we're all tend to tone down the foul language. Occasionally a cuss comes out when we've rolled bad dice, but that's almost inevitable. But certainly at shows, when we've got mixed audiences, children, members of the public, parents, family groups, we're not going to be swearing. We want to present ourselves as best we can, and I'd imagine most clubs would do the same. So, and the same applies when we have guest players in. We're all on their bestest behaviour. We try to give them a good and authentic experience. There's still plenty of banter, but it's toned down the language a little bit. And I imagine most gamers do that. There are some groups that I've seen videos from their games and they don't do that. But I suppose that depends on the group and what's the accepted norm within that group, that audience. And then, of course, there's the context in which we swear. So, using swearing to express anger or as an insult is just a big no-no in general. It's not just a societal rule. And good manners. I just think that it's a sign of someone who hasn't got the intelligence to think through an argument properly. When they have to resort to swearing, they've lost. And the same goes around the games table. We all get frustrated sometimes. We do something, or our opposing player does something that winds us up. Good-natured banter is one thing, a little bit of gentle ribbing, but actually insulting someone or attacking them with foul language is just a big no-no. This is a game. We're meant to be enjoying ourselves after all. Whereas, for instance, swearing at the dice when they roll ones, that's almost a law in our hobby. You know, I've called my dice some pretty colourful language over the years, and I hazard a guess that most people watching this video probably would have as well. And sometimes you can't help yourself when an exclamation of shock or surprise. It goes back to this old adage that swearing actually lowers your pain threshold, and the same applies whether you've cut yourself, stumped your foot, or done something completely stupid in a game. And again, you've got to try and moderate that when you've got a mixed audience around you, but sometimes it's almost inevitable. It's a psychological response to a stressful situation. But the other thing I think we should always bear in mind is, we're playing a game of war at the end of the day. These aren't nuns on the table, these are soldiers, and I'm sure that in the real world they very rarely kept their language clean. I can't imagine your average World War One Tommy was winding his P's and Q's while the shells were falling. So we also have to keep that, I think, a little bit in context. We are playing a game of war, but it is just a game after all. So that World War One example brings me on to historical swearing. Some words, some phrases, some insults have fallen out of fashion, either because the language has changed or the societal conditioning around those words, the context, if you like, for the particular swear word has disappeared. That's an interesting one to think about, because you might be able to find some historical examples that you could use that actually don't offend people because they're not in common use anymore. Now, it's an interesting little factoid that I learned a few weeks ago. I'm sure I've heard this before, but when I was sort of thinking about this subject, I come across this article and it was quite interesting. Apparently, bilingual people find the same swear word less offensive in a foreign language. So when they hear it in their mother tongue, they're more offended. And that finding of research led psychologists and scientists to realise that swearing is much about emotional conditioning from a very early age. So in other words, how we respond and assimilate the reactions of our parents to swear words. So understanding that sort of frees us up a little bit. We're finding that we might be offended by certain words when actually what we're doing is we're reacting to how our parents were offended to it. And society and individuals change from one generation to the next, and maybe we should be less worried about being hung up on what offended our parents and more worried about what is truly offensive to us now in this day and age. So the power to offend with a swear word is very much based on, for me, on the context of its use and the intent of its use. So understanding all this perhaps gives us some new rules to play with. When we understand societal conditioning, emotional conditioning, we can use alternatives. So I've already alluded to the idea that we could use historical swear words. There's plenty of stuff in Shakespeare and Old English, for instance, for those in the English speaking world. I know I'm being very English centric here in my video, but there's plenty of old swear words or insults, for instance, which have lost their emotional conditioning, and you can use them in a much more light-hearted context and in a way that won't offend people. And swearing in a foreign language, again, as I say, it offends less, and it may even be historically accurate. When your French dragoons get wiped out and you exclaim "merde," that's less offensive than some of the alternatives that you might use. And also you can use fake words. So some sci-fi programs do this. Two good examples that immediately spring to mind are the Firefly TV series, which used a combination of sort of pidgin Mandarin to, when they wanted to swear or let off steam, they would say something in Mandarin. And of course the audience most of the audience, that is, had no idea what they were talking about, so they weren't offended by it. And programs like Battlestar Galactica, for instance, employed the use of sound-alike words, homonyms, that sounded like a very obvious swear word but weren't as offensive. So make yourself up a fake word that you can use as a backup when you really can't help yourself. And as I've already mentioned, historical words. Get your Shakespeare out, or even your Churchill. He was a master of insults. There must be some things in there you could use around the games table and keep the historical context of your game going. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. We've looked at the setting, the audience, the context. They're all important, and that there are some alternatives. And I hope it's given you something to think about. I hope that you want to join the discussion and maybe leave some comments below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. And the whole point of these sort of videos is to perhaps start a little conversation to get people thinking about things. I don't claim to have touched this subject, to be the first person to have touched this subject. There's plenty of other stuff available out there, some really good articles, particularly in some of the older Wargames magazines. I can't remember the links now, unfortunately. If I try and find one, I'll put something in the notes at the bottom. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Hopefully we'll see you again next week. Please, in the meantime, stay safe, keep well, and keep rolling high.